Good morning, girls. We are starting the final chapter in the book of First Peter. Someone asked me yesterday if we will continue into Second Peter, and my answer was a little uncertain because I haven't completely decided, but we've got two or three more weeks in First Peter, so I will make that call pretty soon here, but I think so because the message, the context, everything is a continuation. So there's a good chance that that's exactly what we're going to do. So we have a word today that I want to mention. I don't know if any of you listening saw the notes that Phyllis sent out, but the word I want to mention that I think is the theme of our passage today is humility. And it's not a concept or a characteristic of a person that I don't think we see very often anymore in our day and time. It seems to be something that's just gone the way of the dinosaurs, and it's gone the way of a lot of characteristics like holiness and purity, and things that used to be maybe 50, 60 years ago a common language and conversation, but not so much anymore. So the idea of humility is essentially lost, not just in the context of our modern world where strength and being in control is so valued, but really it's kind of a human condition of all time, is that pride is our problem, not humility. We seem to struggle more with getting our pride under control, and that's for all generations and all times. Humility is not something that comes easily for any of us. And so someone asked, so how do we get humility? And I hope that this will become more obvious as we go through the lesson. But I did read something that John Piper said that I thought made a lot of sense. Humility, like a lot of other things that are fruit of the Spirit, are things that begin to show up in our lives the more we get to know Jesus. And so it seems as though humility follows Jesus around. It follows godliness around. So the closer we get to Jesus and the more we grow in our faith, the more likely humility will be observed among God's people. So let's read the passage. It's 1 Peter 5, 1 through 7. So I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker of the glory that is going to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another, for God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him, because he cares for you. So in the first verse we see Peter identifying himself as one of the elders, which is interesting. Remember that our word for the day is humility. And Peter is identifying himself as one of the guys, one of the fellow elders, which is really, truly a big thing, a big point here. And I think it is in agreement with our context, because Peter in chapter 1, verse 1, in order to give authority to the letter he was sending, identified himself as one of the apostles. And in reality, he was one of the big three of the apostles. Peter, James, and John. And Peter's name is always mentioned first, so maybe he is the number one apostle. He really truly had so much recognition, so much authority, so much respect and honor that it would be appropriate for him to identify himself as the apostle of Jesus Christ. Here he chooses to identify himself, though, as one among the elders. So it would be like, I'm sure you've heard of maybe a boss or someone in charge introducing a fellow worker by saying, "Oh, this guy works for me," rather than, as Peter would say in this situation, "This guy is one of my fellow workers. We work together." And so I love that attitude that Peter is starting this chapter about humility. He's identifying himself in a humble way. In addition to identifying himself along with all the elders, he acknowledges his suffering right alongside Jesus. So he's such a team guy. He suffered right alongside Jesus, and that's one of the ways he identifies with Jesus. He identifies with Jesus in his suffering. And so we can all be comforted and strengthened to know by what Peter is saying here is that if we suffer with Jesus, then we will also, as Peter says, we will be fellow partakers in the glory that is going to be revealed. There's so much partnership in that, in all of this. Fellow elder, fellow sharing in the sufferings, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. He mentions the return of Jesus Christ here, which I always love to see that Jesus will return, and that is when the glory is going to be revealed, and we will share in that glory. So then he goes on and talks about the elders. Now I want to give you a few facts about elders that are just kind of background to the office of elder in the church. We'll talk about the specifics of verses 2, 3, and 4 in a minute, but I just want to kind of bring us all on the same page in terms of the office of elder. Back in chapter 1, verse 1, we had read the names of the churches who would be reading this letter, who were receiving this letter, where churches had been planted. You've got Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. And some of the Bible scholars estimate that those cities or towns where churches had been established prior to Peter writing this letter, that there could have been hundreds of small house churches established in these towns. And the point is, what Peter is doing here in exhorting these elders that are reading this letter is to say that we can the implication from this is that in every one of those churches, even if there were hundreds of them, they were all organized around the concept of elder leadership. Elder and pastor are words that were used interchangeably as a noun, but it is most often used as a verb: to shepherd, to pastor, to shepherd the flock of God. And that is us. We are a bunch of sheep. I don't know that you know this about sheep, but they're not exactly smart. They don't necessarily smell good. And they really need a lot of protection and care because they just can't take care of themselves. And I just think that's so incredibly important for us to think about for a second. I don't know about you, but I know that there are women that come to our Bible study that don't attend a church, and they really aren't in a flock that is being shepherded by an elder. And that really troubles me somewhat, that maybe their only flock is coming to Bible study, because I don't shepherd well in the sense of reaching out and overseeing your life experiences in the same way that you would have that if you were in a church that has an elder leadership style. And so I really want to encourage you to become part of a fellowship that has a structure that is a New Testament church structure. Back to the whole concept of elders, Jesus told Peter to feed my sheep and to shepherd my sheep 3 times in John 21. Paul told the Ephesian elders to shepherd the flock of God, which he purchased with his own blood. So feeding the sheep, shepherding the sheep, this is so important to God. And that this is the flock. These are the people that God purchased with the blood of his own Son on the cross. The elder or shepherd's job was to exercise oversight for the flock. So God holds them accountable for how they do this. Elders, shepherds, and overseers are all sheep just like us. But because of their calling, their gifting, their official appointment by the church, they're held to a greater accountability. They actually will be judged by God for how well they exercise their authority. Now let's go back to the specifics of this passage in 1 Peter 5. We can go back in the previous chapter, verse 4, and rethink about the context that we've been talking about for weeks now. In chapter 4, verse 12, we had the statement by Peter where he says, "Don't be surprised by the fiery trials that you are enduring." And so the context of this letter and those actual churches led by people called elders, their context was they were suffering. They were going through difficult times due to their faith in Jesus Christ. And so as Peter now is in chapter 5 speaking to them about this idea of humility and how these elders are to lead with humility, we've got to remember that he's speaking to people that are suffering terribly, suffering in ways that you and I probably don't comprehend. In addition to the verse 12 that reminds us about the suffering, verse 17 reminds us that Peter has just warned them to be aware that judgment is coming. He actually says, "For it is time for judgment to begin in the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God?" So here's the situation with the elders. They know that judgment is going to come, is beginning, has already begun in the church. We're receiving this persecution, these hard times, these struggles, this pain and suffering. We're receiving that as part of God's refining of us as Christians. All of these churches that we've mentioned, they are all receiving the same treatment, and it's part of their sanctification process. And Peter even calls that a form of judgment. We discussed that in the previous recording, that judgment, we view that word as in a negative context, but judgment can be a good thing. Judgment can be, you're not guilty. That's the judgment. That's the verdict. Well, in this case, the judgment or the verdict is because you're mine and because I love you so much and want to prepare you for heaven. My judgment is that I am going to watch how you handle suffering and persecution, because the hotter the fire, the more purifying will be the result. And he is purifying for himself a people who are being prepared for eternity with him in heaven. So remember that context as we look at these 3 admonitions or exhortations that Peter is giving to his fellow elders. Peter's an elder right along with these other elders, but he is also an apostle with authority. So he tells them, don't lead under compulsion, but do lead voluntarily, according to the will of God. So think about their context. Those elders are probably on the front lines as far as receiving this persecution. They are the upfront people, and so they're the ones that get hit first. Maybe they accepted the role as elder before any of this started, and now that the heat is on, maybe they would like to have a new job. Maybe they're thinking, I didn't sign up for this. But they also know that God's judgment is part of what they too are going through, and it's harder than they imagined. There's a parable in John 10 where Jesus makes the statement that the hireling runs away in the face of danger. The hireling being, in the parable, the hireling is someone that's been hired to take care of the sheep. But when the wolf or the lion comes, the hireling runs away. And so that is a picture for us of how in times of trouble and struggle in the church, some of the leadership might quit. And so he is saying, please don't do that. Stay voluntarily, because this is the will of God. Another thing that he is exhorting them is, don't serve as an elder for sordid gain, but with eagerness. In other words, serve the Lord, serve the people with love, because it's an honor to serve the Lord by serving his people. And he says, don't do it for sordid gain. That's an interesting statement to make about these elders. Could it be that some of them were getting kickbacks, or that they were somehow benefiting materially or financially from their serving as elders? And, what would motivate people to do that? I mean, is that a prideful issue? Is that a greed issue? Whatever is at the heart of it, it's not humble. It is very arrogant to think that you could get some kind of material gain for serving God by serving his people and doing it to get money. Paul had warned Timothy in 1 Timothy 6:5 about leaders who regard godliness as a means of gain. And there the word godliness is being used more as a statement of just religion and regarding leadership, religious leadership, as a path to gain, a financial gain. And so even in times of hardship, Peter recognizes that there may be leaders who are in it for the wrong reason, for their pride, their authority, their recognition, and for power. And then finally, the last admonition is not lording it over them, but being examples to the flock. So did Peter know that some of them were leading by bullying? Were some saying one thing in church, but then doing the opposite? Were some of the elders living piously in public, but were a train wreck at home in their personal lives? And so we could go off on a big whole lesson about that, because we've observed leaders in churches who have taken money that was not part of the plan, or who are in personal moral failure as leaders of the church. And so we could go in all kinds of directions, but I don't want to do that, because the point of this is humility. And obviously humility is lacking if leaders are getting involved in some of those things that Peter mentions, because their pride, which is the opposite of humility, their pride is telling them they can do whatever they want to do. And so I think that this is a very important text for church leadership today, that even though we aren't in a position of persecution the way these churches were, there's a lot of really good advice here to leaders today. And then he goes on and he makes sure that they know that there is something good in it for them if they do follow his advice. But he says in verse 4, and when the chief shepherd appears, in other words, when Jesus Christ returns, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. An unfading crown means it's an eternal crown. It's a reward. As he told us in chapter 1, we have an inheritance that will not fade or tarnish or go away. It's an unfading inheritance. And here it's an unfading crown of glory. The New Testament talks a lot about crowns, and those are rewards that will be handed out someday. And this, the implication here is that it's going to happen when Jesus returns in the future. And it's unfading. It will last forever, as contrasted to the crowns that were given in that day and time for Olympic athletes who had won their race. They received a crown, but it was a fading crown. It was basically a crown made of woven together of laurel branches, laurel leaves, and those leaves only lasted a few hours, maybe. They faded away, they dried up and crumbled and were of no value. But our reward as Christians is unfading and lasts forever. So I want to now go on to talk about the heart of this passage, which is this humility aspect. He goes on in verse 5, and he brings us into the conversation. Instead of just focusing on the elders, he brings us in and he says, likewise you. Okay, so this word you is bringing all the rest of us who are not elders and pastors, bringing us into this advice. And this advice still, again, is all about humility. And he's going to make that very clear. So he says, likewise, you who are younger, and that could be younger in their walk with the Lord, or could be literally younger people, submit yourselves to this leadership. He says, likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. What does it require to be subject to another person? Well, it requires humility. Humility is, I think that to call them the younger people in a sense of chronological age really makes sense. Excuse me, because young people, I can remember being young, we tend to be a little rebellious. And we tend to be a little more prideful because we haven't lived much of life and we don't know what's ahead. And so we tend to be a little cocky. And he is calling on younger people to submit to the leadership in the church. But that could also, as we get older, that could also refer to people who are young just in the faith. They have not known the Lord Jesus for a very long time and are not trained in the ways of submission to leadership and authority within a church setting. And so he is including this whole conversation about leadership, about submission, about authority, about humility. He's leading the whole conversation to include all of us and how we relate to the authority in our lives. He goes on to say then in the very next sentence that everyone is included, because he says, still in verse 5, after he says, likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. And then he says, all of you. So that would include everyone, regardless of what their age is, how long they've been a Christian. He says, all of you clothe yourselves with humility towards one another. So clothing ourselves with humility is absolutely essential to the workings out of fellowship in the church, that we all are, literally being deliberate about putting humility on, wearing it as a garment. F.B. Meyer, in one of his commentaries, told the story of John Cecil Rhodes, who was a very important person in South Africa. Rhodesia, actually, I found out, it was called Rhodesia because of John Cecil Rhodes. But anyway, very important man in South Africa, who had invited this young man to come to a large banquet that he was putting on and hosting. And this young man traveled by train quite a distance to arrive at the hall or the home where Cecil Rhodes was putting on this particular event. And he didn't get there in time to bathe and put on clean clothes, and he had to go straight to the banquet in shabby, kind of an unkempt appearance. And so someone saw him and mentioned that to Mr. Rhodes, and Mr. Rhodes excused himself and went back to his closet and changed into a shabby suit, one that was maybe wrinkled and didn't look wonderful, in order to not embarrass this young guest that he had invited to this dinner party. And I thought, what a beautiful picture of clothing yourself in humility. Here's an incredibly important man, a man with a high visibility and a great reputation, who has humbled himself to clothe himself in a way that would honor one of his guests. And so the idea of clothing yourself in humility is one of intentionality. It's one that I don't even know if I could do it. The story of Cecil Rhodes, and taking off the clothing that I had chosen carefully to wear as a hostess of a party, and then to change into something to change into my rattiest blue jeans, and in order to make someone feel better about how they're dressed. That impresses me. That just really kind of grips me, that I could be humble. Could I be humble and do that? So that's the picture that Peter is painting for us of how we are to be very intentional about putting on humility towards each other. But here's the reason he says it. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. I'm pretty much blown away by that statement. God opposes the proud and gives grace to the humble. I want to paint a picture for you of being in opposition to God. To think that God would be in opposition to you or to me. The picture that I have in my mind comes from a couple of passages similar to what Peter has said in 1 Peter, is something James says, where he quotes the same Old Testament verse that Peter is quoting, but with a little difference. He says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore, he gives more grace. God gives more grace to those who are humble. And Proverbs 3:34 says, the Lord mocks the mockers, but is gracious to the humble. So this is a picture of being opposed to the the prideful person or being mocking of the prideful person. But the word oppose is the one that kind of shakes me a little bit, because the thought of being opposed to God or purposely seating myself in a position that is opposed to God seems very dangerous to me. I can't even imagine why anyone would thoughtfully and purposefully put themselves in opposition. But this is exactly what Peter is saying, is that prideful people are deliberately placing themselves in opposition to God. And where Proverbs says the Lord mocks that person. He mocks the person. He opposes the person. It is a very, that's a fearful position to me to be in. I would hopefully not choose to be in opposition to God, because he goes on, First Peter, he goes on and he says, you are to humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. So think about the mighty hand of God for just a second as we consider being opposed to that mighty hand. The mighty hand of God is stated, is used to describe God's power of action in very big events in the Old Testament. The mighty hand of God is what brought the plagues against Egypt and against the Pharaoh in order to get the people out of Egypt. The mighty hand of God is what sent that death angel that went all through Egypt and killed the firstborn of each family. And the mighty hand of God is what opened the Red Sea and carried the people through it. The mighty hand of God is what brought the Red Sea over and drowned the entire Egyptian army. The mighty hand of God is what led Israel through the wilderness. And the mighty hand of God is what allowed them to conquer all of the occupants of the promised land when they arrived there. The mighty hand of God is what caused the world to be flooded and destroyed. The mighty hand of God is a power and a strength that I don't want to come up against. And so here's the picture for me. When I, in my pride, refuse to follow God and His plans and His purposes in any given situation, but I pridefully decide I'll do it myself. I can handle this. I don't need to submit to a church elder. I don't need to submit to my husband. I don't need to submit. I'm saying I don't need to submit to God, because God has ordained that I be under the authority of the elder. I be under the authority of the husband. I am to be under the authority of the rulers. And when I rebel against that authority, I'm rebelling against God, and His mighty hand will oppose me. That is a serious situation. And so He's calling instead for us to humble ourselves to those places in our lives and those circumstances in our lives that He in His sovereignty has ordained for us to go through. We need to submit ourselves to the things that God has prepared for us. They might be painful things. They might be hard things. But remember, God ordained that we go through it. There is nothing that's going on in my life that hasn't been filtered through the hand of God. And Peter is saying, humble yourselves to that. Submit to that. And then he goes on and he says, cast all your cares on the Lord. I mean, the situations I'm going through are causing me anxiety. Okay? It's causing me stress. And he says, you can lose the stress if you'll just humble yourself. All of our anxieties They come from a refusal to submit, a refusal to allow God to have his reign and rule in our lives. And I'm talking to the Christians in this room. I'm not talking to, this is not for non-Christians. This audience that 1 Peter is referring to is the context of the church. I'm talking to me. I'm talking to every single one of my sisters here within my voice who are struggling with circumstances that they don't know what to do with, but pridefully resisting submitting to them, understanding that the sovereignty, our sovereign God, who loves us dearly and cares dearly for us, placed them there. He very, very clearly says to us that as we humble ourselves under the mighty hand of God, at the proper time, he will exalt us as we cast all of our anxieties on him, he who cares for us. Ladies, he cares. He doesn't bring adversity into our lives in an uncaring way. He's very caring in what he allows into our lives, what he brings into our lives. He's very caring because he wants to prepare a people who are ready to be brought into the kingdom of the everlasting kingdom of the Father. And so he puts us in those situations that produce anxiety. But he says, if you'll just humble yourself, submit to it, surrender to it, I'll take your anxiety. I'll take it away. Trust me. Entrust yourself to the one who judges justly. Yes, you're being maligned, you're being persecuted, you're being threatened, you're actually being harmed by people who don't love and respect God the Father. But it's okay. I've got this thing. I know what I'm doing. I am even sovereign over your enemies who are harming you. So trust me. Entrust yourself to me. Your anxieties, your peace will come like incomprehensible. Your peace will flow like a river. Your anxieties will fade away. It will be just as we remember from 1st or 2nd Thessalonians. You will have peace that is beyond the ability to express. The words can't express the peace that passes all understanding. I would rather have that peace than anxiety. And he says his care for us is so great that we are able to have peace instead of anxiety. And that's my prayer for all of us. Do you truly believe that God cares for you? His tender mercies are new every morning. Great is his faithfulness to you and to me. I'll see you next week.